I want to thank the groups that jumped in really quick when we realized Tom Drake was going to be here. Gus Davis flew him in for an event tomorrow down in Gustavus, speaking on very similar mass surveillance and the citizen. So, but we said, you know, people may not drive all the way down to Gustavus. You are free to tomorrow, by the way, if you are still interested. It's not more than an hour and a half away. But since he was going to be here, we quickly organized, and we had the Vets for Peace said, sure, we'll sponsor the Women Against Military Madness Tackling Torture at the top, which if you haven't seen our torture timeline, we kind of drag this around because people are forgetting how this happened. And we really, if everyone doesn't know this, we really still are on the dark side. We have not really come back from that. So our group works to try to expose these atrocities. We don't believe that we should look forward only and never backward, which is the neocon mantra. We think that we need to come to grips with these things. And the other group is Blue Republican, which is Robin Kerner has a national group. This is a group that is for peace. I've been on his radio show before. Juliet Nail actually brought a couple of books and some articles that are very relevant to the talk tonight. It's about authoritarianism. And so this Robin Kerner national level and Blue Republican Minnesota was also a group that jumped in. And the other group is Amy Blumenshine has a group for a ministry for veterans who have suffered moral injury. And this is also very relevant to the exercise of conscience and what Thomas Drake talks about. When this is over, by the way, on the way out, if you're interested, I have this book that Ann Wright, she's one of the people in our group, our Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, has written a book about the exercise of conscience. And when she was here for the WHAM annual meeting, we didn't get all of her books, we didn't get all of her books distributed. So if there's anybody who didn't get a book and would like one, I will actually make Thomas Drake sign Ann Wright's book. So I'm going to turn it over to Al.
It's an excellent book.
It's an excellent book. We also have two books by Robin Kerner of the Blue Republican on similar topics. So only two of those. But if you're interested, they're on that little table on the way out. And thanks. Now Al's going to tell you who I was.
I'm Al Boston. I'm a member of Mount Olive and a bunch of other kind of peace groups. And I want to welcome you. Happy that you're all here. Happy there's a large crowd. And I want to let you know the restrooms are at the end of the hall. If you need a handicapped restroom, take the elevator down to the lower level and then go straight ahead and there's a handicapped restroom. I'm to introduce Colleen Raleigh. It would make more sense if Colleen Raleigh was introducing me, because who's Al Bosman? Everybody knows who Colleen Raleigh is. So, at any rate, Colleen Raleigh is a retired FBI agent, and she ran the legal counsel of the Minneapolis office of Minneapolis FBI. She retired in 2004. She was a 9/11 whistleblower. She testified at the Joint Intelligence Committee and the Senate Judiciary Committee and the Department of Justice Inspector General. Since retirement, she's been involved in peace and the rule of law activities. So give a warm welcome to Colleen Raleigh.
T-shirts. This one is especially on the Orwell was not a how-to book, and then on the back I have something similar about NSA massive surveillance. I only wore this one other time, and it was on the eve of when they signed the National Defense Authorization Act, which, by the way, folks, from a person who taught law, constitutional law, really has turned us into a total police state, because it means that Americans can be detained at will. There's no more due process. They're being cautious in doing that because they think people might get mad. But that has been on the books for years now. And I wore this the night before they passed it at another event. So Tom Drake, I met before, when he was first charged with this, egregious thing of facing decades in jail for being a whistleblower. Basically, he was the precursor of Edward Snowden, but he tried everything. He went to, he'll tell you the story, but he went to all kinds of officials. He even went to the Pentagon, Department of Justice Inspector. We're supposed to be able to go to an Inspector General. When you're working in a secret agency, that everything is secret from the people, you're supposed to, at least, when you witness illegal acts, at the very least, because can you imagine a country that has secret agencies and there's no way that they can be stopped from committing illegal acts? Can you imagine that? Yes. You're supposed to have an Inspector General. So you don't go tell people about it, but you at least go tell an Inspector General. Well, Thomas Drake and fellow whistleblowers, some of you know Bill Binney, who was here a couple of years ago, they did that. And unfortunately, again, one of the IG people was even extremely upset about this, but it all got swept under the rug, and eventually Tom had no choice but to basically make some of this information public. And that's when the shoes started to fall on him. The rest of the whistleblowers were already retired, and he was the only one still working. So Tom is one of the people, when Amy came up with this title of Constitution and Conscience, it's just a wonderful title, because if we just had more Tom Drakes, we would not be in the mess that we are in right now. We need more people of conscience like Tom Drake, and I'm going to let him talk to you now for a while, and if you get a question, save it for it, because he's going to have a Q&A afterwards. Welcome, Tom Drake.
There was a time during my ordeal, I had no voice. Anything I would say in public could have been used against me at trial, what they call impeachable evidence. So I'm here to share with you some thoughts, to share with you some perspective, to share with you my conscience. I'm also here to share with you some history and also ask some questions that I'm sure will be addressed during the Q&A as well, but ask questions in terms of what future do we want to keep. Back during the Constitutional Convention as it ended, it is reported in history, we don't know this as actual fact, but there are accounts that a woman reporter actually asked Benjamin Franklin, what did you all create in there? And remember, this was a Constitutional Convention that was held in the deepest of secrecy. There was a lot at stake for this very young country. And they had just lived through the Articles of Confederation, which were an utter failure. So things were in the balance, as one might say, in terms of the history of the United States. And he said, a republic, if you can keep it. It was a grand experiment. There were no guarantees. Out of that, it took 2 years as a bunch of words on paper circulated to the original 13 colonies. It took 2 years to ratify it. I remember the original Constitution had no Bill of Rights. It took another 2 years because the question arose, where are the protections against the government intruding on us as the people? I mean, the preamble did say, we the people I'll get back to that later, in order to form a more perfect union. Just a piece of paper, some words on it. Extraordinary document. Yes, there were flaws in it. Yes, there was fault lines. There was a whole lot of stuff that got kicked down the road. We know that, because 47 years later, Civil War. I mention the Constitution because standing in front of you is an individual who took an oath to support and defend that Constitution 4 times in his government career. Why do those who enter government service, and in my case, the United States Air Force during the latter years of the Cold War, flying in RC-135s in the European theater, listening in on the communications of the Warsaw Pact, and in particular in my specialty area as a German-Russian cryptolinguist, listening in on the communications of what was then referred to, known as East Germany. A police state, a surveillance state. I also took an oath to support and defend the Constitution at the CIA, at the Navy as a reserve intel officer down at the Pentagon during the 90s. And then the 4th time was as a member of the senior executive service assigned to the National Security Agency. That oath is an oath to support and defend the Constitution. Just a piece of paper with some words on it. The rule of law in the United States of America. Everything else is secondary. The Constitution is the law of the land. There is no other law before it or ahead of it. Because if you don't have rule of law, what do you have? Something other than law. And that would not make the United States a constitutional republic, a special form of democracy. I'm emphasizing the Constitution right up front. It was triggered by seeing make the rule of law apply to all from the president on down. Because what I'm going to share with you in a few short minutes, and all this is just a very, very small part of a much larger ordeal that I experienced. But it's important to set the period in which I was confronted by the reality that the rule of law was essentially disappeared after 9/11. And there's people to this day that do not believe me, but when you are faced with the distinct prospect that as a result of 9/11 at the highest levels of the government itself, with the approval of the President of the United States, said that the rule of law in secret was no longer in force. That the 4th Amendment, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and other statutes were null and void. In secret. So no one knew. 9/11 was a trigger event in which the White House, amongst a number of things, including state-sponsored torture, my fellow whistleblower and friend now, John Kiriakou, in fact, we're the only 2 people who were prosecuted after being criminally investigated, charged, ultimately convicted and sentenced. Only 2 people with respect to mass domestic surveillance and torture that were prosecuted by the United States government because we blew the whistle. What does it mean to a country that ostensibly claims that it's based on the rule of law, decides because of a fundamental failure to provide for the common defense, one of the 2 primary responsibilities of the government in the preamble, besides the general welfare, subverts the same Constitution? What does it say? Because see, I was faced with a Pandora's box that opened up in front of me literally in the days, weeks, and months after 9/11. And when I'm staring into that box, and all of those secret furies were coming out, that abyss was staring back at me. I had a moral choice to make, but not just a moral choice. I had taken an oath. I was not going to break faith with that oath. That oath was fundamental to what made America unique as a nation, founded and grounded on the rule of law. Yes, there have been some interesting crises and tensions that had existed since the early days of the nation. But here I was confronted by something far more virulent, something far more pernicious. I was literally eyewitness to the subversion of the Constitution by my own government and approved by the White House. After confronting my immediate supervisor, the number 3 person in NSA, and others, in the first week of October of 2001, I had, and still to this day, it chills me when I repeat what I'm about to share with you. Because I said, what are we doing violating the Constitution? Not only are we violating the Constitution, we're violating the 4th Amendment, we're violating the very statute that is exclusive means by which NSA can actually surveil a US person. That was the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, passed in 1978 by President Carter. Why was that passed? Why do we need to have a foreign intelligence? Wasn't the 4th Amendment good enough? Well, it turns out that NSA, CIA, FBI, military have been routinely violating the 4th Amendment of the Constitution since the end of World War II. I will just throw out a few names: Chaos, COINTELPRO, Minaret, Shamrock, among others. Shamrock, interestingly enough, was the text message system of the day, telex. For decades, until it was revealed in the Church Committee in 1975, every telex that was ever sent or delivered was routinely turned over to NSA in the deepest of secrecy, in the cooperation with the 3 primary companies responsible for servicing and maintaining that system, including Western Union, including RCA Global. In fact, NSA had been created by literally the stroke of a secret presidential pen in 1952, not legislated into law. I was well aware of this history because I grew up as a very young teenager in the 1970s. And I remember watching in social studies class in Vermont, where I grew up, also in Texas earlier, but as a teenager in Vermont, watching extraordinary impeachment proceedings against the President of the United States, remembering that one of the articles of impeachment was the abuse by the President of instruments of national power. Watch the President resign the office of the presidency. That no president, not even the President, was above the law. Except I also remember him saying something about if the President says it's okay, it's not illegal. So the first week in October of 2001, I confronted the lead attorney at NSA in the Office of General Counsel. He's actually interviewed in the Frontline PBS special called United States of Secrets that came out a few years ago. He has a very pretzel logic response when asked about my confrontation with him. After confronting him with why are we violating the Constitution and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the B-23 legal regime that existed in 1978, he said, "You don't understand, Mr. Drake." This proceeded to tell me, this is almost a direct quote, I'm paraphrasing partly, because this conversation had gone on for a while. It's all legal. The White House has approved the program. We are the executive agent. As soon as he said it's all legal, the hair standing up on the back of my neck, because I was thrown back to President Nixon. It's all legal. The White House has approved it. Wow. I knew in that moment that I faced a critical choice of conscience, that I could act like I never heard that. I could act like I was not aware that, and I had been for quite a while in the preceding weeks, that the enormous power of NSA was now being turned on the United States of America and treating the United States just like a foreign nation for the purposes of mass dragnet surveillance on an incredible scale that quickly metastasized over the intervening years, starting with phone numbers. And I knew that I could not remain silent watching my own government subvert the very Constitution that I had taken an oath 4 times to support and defend, and that I was now going to defend that Constitution against my own government. And it's the White House that's approved the subversion of the Constitution, placing the U.S. under the equivalent of virtual martial law. There's no other way to say it. Emergency powers, which are still in existence to this day, continuity of government. And furthermore, the phrase that was used by this same attorney was exigent conditions. And for those of you who are lawyers in the audience, exigent conditions is a very interesting phrase, because as it was explained to me by this same attorney, we just need the data. You understand, everything has changed. It's all different now. Now remember, the government had failed to keep almost 3,000 people out of harm's way. We had not provided for the common defense, and this was never supposed to happen. Never again would there be an electronic Pearl Harbor. 5 days after 9/11, Vice President Cheney, who's central to understanding my story, but I don't have time to go into it, 5 days after 9/11 said we're going to go to the dark side. What the heck does that mean? So apparently national security, which I have called the state religion, do not question it. That's what this Q stands for, question everything, especially authority. But invoking the primacy of national security, it took priority and precedence over the Constitution. As I was told later, you don't understand, Mr. Drake, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. You mean that we're that weak as a country that we cannot stand a crisis of this nature, separate from the fact that we failed to protect people? Apparently so. So I decided that I would have to actively defend the Constitution against my own government, that I would report literally, as defined in the Constitution, high crimes and misdemeanors committed by senior government officials, which I subsequently named in a number of formal government investigations into 9/11, to multiple channels, and I became a whistleblower. It was not a career aspiration, by the way, to become a whistleblower. And I've had people actually tell me, with everything that happened to you later, Tom, why did you do this? You didn't make the decisions, you were not the approving authority, you did not implement the programs. So, reporting state crimes became a crime of state. Wow. Reporting state crimes became a crime of state. And I will tell you that none of this was necessary. It was never necessary to violate willfully as an act of commission. It was never necessary. to violate the Constitution. And at NSA, the very best of American ingenuity and innovation had solved the problem, but rejected by NSA. Rejected. And so a program called Stellar Wind, which is an umbrella program, had many other programs underneath it, was launched as one of the deepest state secrets that has ever existed in United States history. I just happened to be there, was eyewitness to all of this unfolding. And I proceeded for the next several years to blow the whistle to anybody that would listen, sometimes all by myself, sometimes in partnership with others, including Bill Binney, including Diane Rourke. In fact, Diane Rourke went as far as attempting to get the audience of then Chief Justice Rehnquist without success. That the executive branch was an abject violation of the Constitution, and it was all unnecessary. Severe retaliation ensued. I ended up as the NSA chair, ironically enough, teaching at the National Defense University. In 2006, I was a visiting professor of behavioral science, focused in teaching leadership ethics, strategic leadership, and national security policy. In July of 2007, my fellow NSA colleagues and Diane Rourke were visited by the FBI, East and West Coast. And 4 months later, I was looking out at my bedroom window getting ready to go to work. And I see quite a few cars pulling up in front of my house and FBI agents streaming across the front yard. And in that moment, I knew the nightmare had begun. So imagine you're me. They're an hour after you, and why were they coming after you? Well, you have to remember, almost 2 years prior in the New York Times, an interesting article was published because of earthquake within the national security establishment, written by Eric Lichtblau and James Rising. Front page above the fold, New York Times. Turns out that the FBI thought that I was the ringleader behind that story, that I was a really, really good spy because there was no evidence that I had gone to the New York Times or any of the New York Times reporters. That information, by the way, had been withheld for 14 months at the insistence of the White House, putting tremendous pressure on the then New York Times editor, chief editor, Bill Keller, making an argument that for national security, it was so vital to the protection of the United States that to reveal it, people's lives will be lost or in jeopardy. This is always sort of the zero-sum game defense as to why the government needed to continuously violate the Constitution in secret. I knew that when this article was published that I'd become a target. And 2 weeks later, a massive criminal leak investigation was launched by the DOJ. About a dozen people were raided. I was targeted in April, along with others, April of 2006. I cooperated, by the way, to accelerate forward with the FBI. Now, the lawyers in the audience would say you should never cooperate with the FBI. You want to have an attorney representing you. I continued to report high crimes and misdemeanors. They didn't want to hear about that. They were there to find any and all evidence in my house. They spent 9 hours in my house, taking everything of any value, and then some. Just imagine your house crawling with FBI agents in every nook and cranny. They even went so far as they went out into my yard. They had poles poking the ground. Now, I was more than a passing student of history and politics. Remember, I grew up as a very young teenager. I was well aware of what had happened to Ellsberg. I was actually well aware, given where I worked, regarding traditional spies in U.S. history, including Robert Hansen, including people like Alger Hiss and others. During the so-called pumpkin papers caper, there was ostensibly secret papers that were housed in a pot. Pumpkin papers caper. And so they were looking for containers buried, in which I was, quote unquote, harboring state secrets. Long story short, 2 years later, almost 2 years later, in a nondescript FBI facility outside Washington, D.C., in a room with no windows, and I was in New York City at the time, attempting to clear my head. It was an extraordinarily beautiful spring day in New York City. I was actually in Central Park. I get a phone call from the contact agent of the FBI saying, we need you to come down to our facility. When I got there, they said, there's someone here to see you. So remember, this is now 5 months later after I've been raided. It's April 2008. And when I walk into this room, guess who was there to meet me? The chief prosecutor. This is an extraordinarily Kafkaesque experience for those who've read Franz Kafka, because there was the chief prosecutor who had led the team for almost 2 years to attempting to find the leakers to the New York Times. And I can tell you, based on the search warrant, they were looking for anything related to that New York Times article as well as other things. What I didn't tell you is that I did make a fateful decision after going through every whistleblower channel that existed in which I was actually exposed. All those protected channels were not protected channels, they were exposure channels. After going through all those channels, I made a fateful decision to touch the third rail, exercise my First Amendment rights. First Amendment. The cornerstone amendment of the United States of America and the U.S. Constitution. I exercised my First Amendment rights for redress of grievances and exercising freedom of the press. And I went to a reporter with what I knew that was unclassified regarding the secret surveillance programs, massive multi-billion-dollar fraud, waste, and abuse, and NSA culpability in the 9/11 intelligence failures. So I paused for a moment, because I knew that in doing so, that I could find myself on the receiving end of the Espionage Act. I was intimately familiar with Ellsberg's history. I was also well aware of what happens to spies. And so, in March, so the chief prosecutor, April of 2008, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself or you, because it's critical because I want to get to the Q&A here in a few minutes, like 15 minutes at most, to really have a critical conversation with you about the future of what we are facing. Not just as people in the United States, but what the world's facing in terms of freedom and liberty and the moral arc of the universe. It's not pleasant. I'm a living example of having to stand up, speak truth to power, and find myself criminalized because I dared to do so. But I'm standing in front of you as a free human being. Free. I'm free because they were never able, in the end, to take away my liberty. They didn't. They tried everything they could. So it's April 2008, and just imagine you're me for the moment, and here's the chief prosecutor of this extraordinary investigation, which it turns out from New York Times reporting in the summer of 2010 involved at least 5 full-time agents, 5 full-time prosecutors, 25 full-time FBI agents, and they were drawing agents from their elite mole hunter unit. Mole hunters in the FBI, and Coley Raleigh would know what I'm referring to directly, were the elite of the elite in finding real spies amongst us. I spent a fair amount of time in that FBI facility, it turns out, and I remember walking by desks and mole hunter. So imagine that they're using the best of the best to suss out spies to go after people like me who are only speaking truth to power, and then turn into whistleblowers because of government wrongdoing and criminal conduct committed by the government itself under the cover and color of national security rule, not law. A person who is central to understanding my case, pause for a moment, Michael V. Hayden. At a CPAC conference last year, Lou Dobbs is moderating a debate between Michael V. Hayden and Judge Napolitano, Fox News, constitutionalist libertarian, whatever else you might think of him, or Michael V. Hayden. And when asked what was the legal basis for all that secret surveillance prior to the ex post facto, for the lawyers in the crowd, will know exactly what I'm talking about. It is unconstitutional to pass laws that make lawful what was unlawful, but they did that through Congress in the second administration, the second Bush administration, starting in 2007. He was asked, what was the legal basis? 3-word answer: raw executive authority. I defy anybody looking at any article in the Constitution, including Article 2, including even the special commander-in-chief powers of Article 2, I defy anybody anywhere in the Constitution that grants the President of the United States of America raw executive authority. Because if you're exercising raw executive authority, what form of governance is that?
Dictatorship.
Wow. Jane Mayer wrote an article about what happened to me, a seminal article, even though it's a little dated now. Came out May of 2011 as I was facing public trial and 35 years in prison, in which Diane Wark had, there's a reference made to her confronting Michael V. Hayden. Why did you do this? His answer to her was 4 words: we had the power. Wow. Consider the pathology of that power, the extraordinary irresponsibility of that power, making the assertion that the president can do whatever the president feels like in the name of national security. So this chief prosecutor introduces himself and looks at me and says, Mr. Drake, how would you like to spend the rest of your life in prison? Pause for a moment. You can imagine what's going through my mind. I knew I was under a really, really dark shadow. I was behind several 8 balls already. Now he's saying that I could very easily spend the rest of my life, actually I believe he used the word natural life, I guess for emphasis, in prison if I did not cooperate with their investigation. We have more than enough evidence to put you away for a long, long time. And I literally looked at him and said, I will not plea bargain with the truth. If you have that evidence, take me to court. I still have rights under the Constitution. But I knew in doing that I still face many decades in prison. So now accelerate forward to March 2010, almost 2 years later. In secret, I am charged, in secret, in the same FBI facility. 3 weeks later, in a very public manner, I was formally indicted by the Department of Justice for counts of making false statements, which in themselves were actually false. 1 for obstruction of justice. That count alone was worth 20 years. 5 charges under the Espionage Act, a 1917 World War I era act updated in 1950 under the National Security Act of 1950 to deal with Alger Hiss and the Pumpkin Papers caper. Thank you, Senator Pat McCarran. Yes, that's the same McCarran International outside of Las Vegas. World War I era. designed to go after spies, not whistleblowers. Very publicly indicted. I spent 14 years doing everything I could with some extraordinary support from my whistleblower defense attorney, Jesselyn Radak. I ended up being declared indigent before the court, so I could no longer afford any criminal defense attorney. I was facing at least $1 million bill at that point, even before trial, so I was appointed public defenders. Let's just say that when you're facing a prospect of spending 35 years in prison, well, that's a lot better than the rest of your life, right? I mean, that's some relief, right? Might be a few years left over at the end. Let's just say that what matters in life all of a sudden gets really, really focused. There's not much left in terms of extra baggage. I was put under severe restrictions. I could not leave the local area without permission from the court, and the government had right of first refusal. I was effectively a virtual political prisoner in my own country, and they confiscated my passport. Although the government made a case that I was a flight risk, the judge actually rejected that. But it's routine in these matters. And remember, I'm charged with espionage. There is no public interest defense. It's a strict liability charge. And the basis, it's really important to emphasize this, the basis for going after the Espionage Act, it was fundamentally a First Amendment case. But I had gone to a reporter. It was assumed that by going to a reporter with what I knew, that I'd shared tippy-top deep state secrets with that same reporter, and that made me in violation of the Espionage Act. First whistleblower since Ellsberg charged blank manner. Jesselyn Radak knew, after she wrote this extraordinary op-ed in the LA Times, that this was not just now a war on whistleblowers, it was an attack on the First Amendment, and the press was being placed on alert. I hadn't shared something with you. What I knew is that NSA, as part of this secret mass domestic surveillance program, had a special cutout. It was originally known as First Fruits, what a name, to do targeted but expanded targeted surveillance on reporters, journalists, and media outlets. An abject violation of the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment and a number of other statutes, that the press was considered a threat, because they were in fact worried that someone like myself could, or a reporter, an intrepid investigative reporter, reporters like Eric Lichtblau, like James Risen, or others, could come across or stumble across this incredibly deep state secret. But see, I'm standing in front of you. I didn't end up in prison. All I did was support and defend the Constitution. And if it meant going to prison, then that's the price that I would pay. Do you know what it means not to have, and I say this with some emotion, I still say this with some emotion every time I share this with an audience. Do you know what it means to stand in front of you with the extraordinary freedoms that we are granted, those inalienable rights to associate one to another, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, those incredibly eloquent words in the Declaration of Independence, and not have those taken away from you? They mean more to me now than ever. I wake up in the morning and I pinch myself that I am free, because they never took them away from me. I recognize, and it's surreal for me to acknowledge this, that to this day, post 9/11, I am the only person who has managed to keep the government at bay and not end up in prison, or, with the exception of Ed Snowden, having to escape the United States to even have any chance of any form of freedom, let alone a voice. What does that say about what's happening in our country? I have history screaming in my ear. No one ever said democracy or the Constitutional Republic was easy. No one ever said that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was easy to keep. But once they start taking it away, it's really hard to get it back. I know how hard it is, because that's all I could do for 14 months. I had nothing left. There was no privacy. They spent 4 years with an incredibly high magnification digital microscope looking into every single aspect of my life. And I'm saying everything. So just take yourself for a moment. Now the East Germans, interesting enough, the Stasi, had a very interesting phrase for this, what they call Zersetzung, which literally means chemical decomposition, which means how do you break down a human being? Imagine the FBI and others peering into every corner of your life. I mean every corner. I don't care what corner it is. I don't care if you live in a glass house or a round house. It may not have corners. You may have drawers, you may have buckets, you may have cabinets, because that's how open my life became to the government. I was labeled an enemy of the state. And to give you a sense of why the government is still ticked off to this day, that I managed to escape their clutches. But also I'm burdened at the same time by those who lost their jobs because of their association with me. The fact that I have family members that work for NSA and were put under incredible pressure. The fact that people that I was a senior executive, I had enterprise teams, that people that used to work for me were summarily visited and interrogated by either the FBI or counterintelligence officials of the NSA. That NSA said to those who used to work with me and knew me, if you associate with Mr. Drake, you are in danger of losing your ability to remain employed by NSA. I was in Strasbourg, France, in the fall of 2015. I was invited to speak at a democracy conference on the future of democracy. You might remember there was an incredibly tragic terrorist incident that had occurred in Paris just a few short days prior to this event. And I was in my motel and I got this urgent message from a reporter. Irony in my case is I got to know all kinds of reporters, not just the one that I went to. He said, you got to see this, Tom. Well, it turns out there was this briefing. A formal briefing was being given and distributed by the co-director of the Joint Department of Justice, DNI, Director of National Intelligence, National Insider Threat Task Force. And during the course of this briefing, there was a slide with pictures of people on it. It was labeled at the top, it was a classic government PowerPoint slide, those who would do us harm. On this rogues gallery were classic spies from more recent history in the United States, including people like Robert Hanssen, who under his name had the flag of Russia. There was others that had the flag of Communist China. There was others that had the flag of Cuba. My picture, and the picture they took, was me accepting the Ridenour Truth-Telling Prize in 2011. Incredible irony. Was right below Robert Hanssen's. Next to mine was Hassan, the Fort Hood shooter. Next to Hassan was Ed Snowden. Next to Ed Snowden was Alexis, the shooter down at the Washington Navy Yard. None of us had flags under our names. Do you know what it means as an American to be regarded by your own country as one who has no country and is considered to be a traitor and one who did the country harm. So it apparently speaking truth to power about state crimes makes me a traitor. What's worse, and I do carry this in some ways with a rather macabre badge of honor, during the presentation, in order to label me further, they said that I was self-radicalized. Isn't it interesting that I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America? A father who's 94, survivor's guilt, the only man that got out of an airplane flying OSS missions in northern Greece. And all those veterans during my 240 hours of community service from World War II to the present day. In spite of serving my country faithfully, I was labeled a traitor because I dared speak truth to and about power. So if I was self-radicalized because I simply chose to not break faith with the oath that I had taken to support and defend the Constitution, then so be it. How ironic in terms of the history. You can never take rights, liberty, or freedom for granted. I know that more than I could have ever imagined in all of my service to the country. But this goes far beyond who we are. And I want to open this up for Q&A, but I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts before we do so. I spend, and I often have to turn down invitations, because there's only so much of me to go around. And I realize I serve as inspiration and encouragement for others, that it is possible to stand up, no matter how much they attempt to knock you down. It is possible to prevail against the government, despite the longest of odds. But here's the real dilemma we face as people. See, those extraordinary words, I go back to the Constitution. For all the faults and foibles of we as American people, we have a lot of dark history. I well remember that dark history. When I was in survival school, before I went overseas to fly in RC-135s as a cryptolinguist, we had to go through prisoner of war camp. And I, in prisoner of war camp, was exposed to what later became known as enhanced interrogation techniques. They reverse engineered that program, which was a resistance program. It was never designed. I was waterboarded twice. I went through the Chinese water drip in a training environment. Stressed positions, lying on a cold concrete floor, bag over your head, incredibly loud music, losing all track and sense of time in a training environment within the space of 12 hours. This is the United States of America. We are told in no uncertain terms that we're better than those who have come before us. We practice the rule of law. We have a Constitution. We have the 8th Amendment. Torture doesn't result in anything. Torture is not effective, nor does it get whatever you think you want to get. It is literally a punishment regime of incredibly severe proportions. And I have dark knowledge of that because of where I used to work. We know that at least 54 countries were involved in torture. The state sponsor. We know that there was several black sites. We know there was rendition flights. For what? What did I say about myself and John Kiriakou? We're the only two people criminally investigated, charged, convicted, and sentenced. He ended up 2 years in prison because he faced 45 years and he has 3 children under the age of 10. I know what the pressures are. I recognize that when the government wants to do you in, they have a lot of instruments at their disposal. All I had left was what it means to be a human being. I had nothing left to defend except the essence of what it means to be you and me. See, I want to leave you with this and open up for Q&A. That preamble says, we the people. It says, we the people. It doesn't say the government. There isn't some exception clause. It doesn't say something except when national security conditions prevail. It doesn't say the president. It doesn't say the elite. It says we the people. In order to form a more perfect union. I have dedicated the rest of my life to defending life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know why? We can't be who we are as human beings. We can't rise to the highest possibility of who we are together if we can't pursue happiness together. I don't have the freedom to pursue happiness if I don't have liberty. And I don't have liberty absent life. How dare the government or any power claiming sovereignty over who I am or who we are as people. Yes.
I'm wondering, who is in charge? I mean,
Who is-
really, I mean, it
who
looks
is in
like
charge?
it's global, and so I'm wondering who's running the world, not just this country, but the world, because it seems like it's happening all over. There's a global attack on education, there's a global attack on, you name it, on journalists, and environmentalists. Who's
Probably
running the
did.
world?
Thank you. You know, Pogo had an interesting cartoon. We have met the enemy. Yeah. Us. Who's in charge? You know, I'm going to answer this probably a little bit differently than perhaps you're expecting, although I recognize that's quite a question, who's in charge? There's a lot of people that want to be in charge. There's a lot of people who would like to be in charge. There's a lot of people who have career aspirations to simply have power over others. My experience is that with very few and rare exceptions, those who aspire to have power over others are compensating because they enjoy the power over others. Thank you. When I was a non-commissioned officer in the military, this will give me an opportunity to segue right to history. And as a commissioned officer in the United States Navy at the Pentagon. I was actually an all-source intelligence officer, and I sat at the electronic intelligence desk, the terrorism desk, and the Middle East North Africa desk. I was actually there when they attempted to drop the Twin Towers in New York City the first time with truck bombs. We sent out reports that they're coming back, but no one would listen to us. So yeah, there's people in charge in the military. The president's in charge of the executive branch, right? But in the military, because of what happened in World War II, they modified the Uniform Code of Military Justice, Article 92. You're only required to follow lawful orders. You actually have an obligation as a non-commissioned officer or as an officer, or anybody in the military, to question any order to ensure that it's lawful. And if it is unlawful, if it violates the Constitution, if it violates any amendment of the Constitution, if it violates international conventions against torture, if it violates the Geneva Conventions, you don't have to follow the order. It is unlawful. In fact, you are required to resist that unlawful order. This goes back to the Nuremberg trials. I've actually spoken, unfortunately he passed away a few years ago, one of the chief attorneys who sat on the prosecution team at Nuremberg. The idea that simply following orders was legitimate defense, right? That you had no moral obligation to resist. You were just doing your job. But here, post 9/11, speaking of who's in charge, the president was in charge of national security via Vice President Cheney, sidekick David Addington, in a conspiracy with George Tenet and Michael V. Hayden. That's why, obviously, and because, see, I didn't tell you another punchline. I actually talk about who's in charge. If the Constitution is the law of the land, all bow before it, okay, in terms of rule of law. There is no some other law. There's no extra legal entity or mechanism. There's no extra constitutional law. There's no extrajudicial law, except those who followed the orders that were issued by the president and incredibly super secret findings at the time, as well as other covering memos by people like John Yoo and company out of the Office of Legal Counsel to justify the government's actions in secret. Well, if you followed those orders, you have nothing to worry about, because you're just following orders in good faith. Except I questioned one of the key orders, which was turning the United States of America into a foreign nation. See, that attorney, I confronted him. I said, well, if the laws don't work, if the FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was the exclusive means by which NSA could conduct targeted, warranted surveillance, although there was a condition, you could actually hot pursuit, emergency, right? But you still have to go back to the secret court for the warrant, right? That was like public safety, okay? Or a direct imminent threat, not the imminent definition that was used by others later. Imminent could mean months or years later. A real imminent threat. Then, you know, that was FISA, and it was updated 5 times since 1978 to keep up with the times and the technology. There's a constitutional means. I said to him, there's a constitutional means by which you change law. You go to Congress. He said, with what we want to do, they'll say no. Wait a minute, this was 9/11. My own immediate supervisor, Maureen Baginski, her name's not redacted in this because she was a public figure, actually went to the FBI to create their intelligence directorate. When we're going around NSA campus consoling the workforce because they knew we had failed the nation, we'd failed to keep almost 3,000 people out of harm's way. Almost 3,000 people were murdered, including almost 300 foreign nationals. She says, you don't understand. NSA is a gift to NSA. I mean, 9/11 is a gift to NSA. We'll get all the money we want and then some. It sounds like somebody was going to use the crisis, just like Rahm Emanuel said, never let a good crisis go to waste, and cash in big time, sell national security to the highest bidder. I say all this because that whole thing with that attorney, Congress would have signed off on anything. They did pretty much in the dark of night, shortly after the Patriot Act, which was then secretly interpreted by the executive to mean any business record, irrespective of whether it had anything to do with terrorism. Who's in charge? If those in charge are violating the fundamental rule of law, then what I faced was extraordinarily troubling for the future of the Republic. Because I was eyewitness literally to the subversion of the Constitution, the deepest of secrecy, and using state secrets to protect the secret that the government was in violation of that same Constitution. Not only had the wheels come off our form of special governance, we were in an entirely different vehicle I did not recognize. And if you extend the oath that I took, it's to support and defend the Constitution against all. All enemies, foreign and domestic. That what I was now having to deal with was an alien form of government. It absolutely violated the Constitution. It was coming from inside our own government. Remember, this legacy of secret or unitary, the theory of unitary executive power has been passed on to Obama, who provided the legal framework, and has now been given to Trump, who likes to rule by executive order, and is called the press the enemy of the people. Hey, that's, are those just mere words? He's in charge of the executive branch of the government. I thought it was we the people who were in charge. So see, we're back to we the people, because we the people is ultimately where all this ends up. And this is where I do make some audiences uncomfortable, because then I hold up a mirror to ourselves. It's easy to project, it's easy to blame, and I'm the first to tell you, I did everything I could and others to hold the government accountable to the rule of law. But who's in charge? With great power comes great responsibility. The problem is, with great power comes extraordinary irresponsibility when exercised in secret or covered over by secrecy and national security. A whole lot's being done in the name of national security. I've called this state religion, it's a belief system. Don't dare question it. See, this cue here is question everything, especially authority, especially secret authority. Because where does authority come from? That's an interesting conversation in terms of where does authority come from and who is the authority. Under the rule of law as established by the Constitution, no one is above it, not even the president. Next question, yes ma'am.
Thank you. My question is, in any of these, say, mass surveillance type situations, how do so many of we the people participate in it? In any one of these, there had to be hundreds or thousands of people, for example, at the NSA, when they decided to collect data. You even mentioned back in the 50s, the telex cases where they were collecting telegrams and things. Somebody had to build a database to collect it. Somebody had to create a program to collect that. Then they went to private companies. So now outside of the government, they went to, you said Westinghouse, I think was a company at the time.
RCA Global was one of the others.
Right, they go to Verizon now, they go to AT&T, they go to Yahoo, they go to for your emails and all that. So there's hundreds of lower level people, worker bees, that see this type of activity. Do they get a task that is segmented so small they don't realize they're participating in this?
That's part of it.
Or, right, or do they know they're participating and they're afraid? Or do they actually not realize they're violating the Constitution? Are
They
they
do,
unaware?
but they choose to remain silent. I rocked the boat. Look, I had people who came to me, one almost in tears, who said, I agree with you, Tom. We violated the law. We did it. It wasn't by accident.
Right.
It was approved by the White House. They acknowledged all that, except I have a pension at risk. I don't want to lose my retirement. I have a mortgage on my house. I have kids in college. I have bills to pay. So where does our security really lie? If it's Abraham's Maslow hierarchy of needs, as long as the roof over my head, quote unquote, is being taken care of, then it's not my problem. Except it is. It is our problem. And this is actually what we face. And part of my responsibility, because I was able to stand up to the government, and I'm here to share with you in the full freedom and liberty of coming all the way to Minnesota to say that. It is our problem. It's us. It really is us. It's our future. It's our choice. But I'm well aware of history. I'm well aware of Ellsberg. I've talked extensively with Ellsberg. The very first person I was introduced to after I was so publicly indicted, the very first person that Jesselyn Rada, my extraordinary whistleblower attorney, was Daniel Ellsberg. But she knew that there was no one else. It was a universe of one who knew exactly what I was going through other than herself. And that was Ellsberg. He went through every channel that existed during that time. He went to Senator Mansfield and others. He went to the highest levels of the government Radio silence. Did you know that in my own case, many attempts were made by people who knew me, people that were actually politically connected to the power centers of Congress, including Bernie Sanders, including Patrick Leahy, including Lamar Smith, who represented the district and where my father retired in San Antonio. And it was only Lamar Smith that even had the courtesy to respond. You know what the letter said? Not in my jurisdiction. There was people in Congress looking forward to seeing me in an orange jumpsuit. This is a bipartisan affair, folks. Don't tamper with the real power. And so part of the challenge here, frankly, is that you have this extraordinary power of national security and the establishment behind it. You see what you see. This is the part of the answer to your question. And you talk about a dark joke at NSA. This would be the typical refrain. Directors come and go, but we're still here. Presidents come and go, but we're still here. Now, it's not just NSA. I'm sure there's people that used to work at the FBI, and I know at least one person who could attest to this, in terms of the history of the FBI holding hostage those in power, elected power. So where's the real power? Well, information is power. Information is the coin of the realm. And if I have power in secret, what can I use it for? See, I'm the first to tell you, this mass surveillance, some people know it's victimless, right? Or I'll hear, you have nothing to worry about, right? So I have nothing to hide, nothing to worry about. You know who actually said that? Literally said a version of that phrase. It's chilling. Goebbels, the Nazi-era minister of propaganda. Because it's the government that's determining whether or not you have something to hide. Which means, just like in the early years of the 13 colonies, before the violent American Revolution, an officer of the king could literally show up at your doorstep with a piece of paper. That's all it took, and could take you away, could take your papers away, or any of your effects. And if you resisted, guess what? So the Fourth Amendment means something. As I've shared in many, many audiences, young audiences who are only in kindergarten, first or second grade, as I was shared with me during a journalism class that I spoke at with a noted Washington Post reporter, Dana Priest. She's on assignment at the University of Maryland in College Park. When I asked them, where were you on 9/11, they all said kindergarten, first grade, or second grade. They don't know what a pre-9/11 world is like. They've brought up in this post-9/11 era, a national security world. But they recognize they're inheriting a future that was created then. I have great hope, by the way, although hope's not a strategy. But remember, at the bottom of Pandora's box does exist, once all the theories escape, is a thing called hope. Next question. Yes?
What do you think of Bradley Manning, now Chelsea Manning?
Looking forward to giving Chelsea a huge hug in a couple of weeks.
Give him one for all of us.
I spent many, many days with Jessalyn Radak going to the court-martial within 10 feet of Chelsea in military uniform. And her pose, her bearing, my military officer, was extraordinary. I'm well aware the pressures were enormous and that she attempted to commit, that we know of, suicide at least twice while at Fort Leavenworth. She has spent a huge percentage of her life in prison, incarcerated, was tortured, solitary confinement. Obama, I believe, in his own weird mea culpa way, recognized that the penalty for having violated the Espionage Act with others, or in my case, where they dropped all the charges and I pled out to a minor misdemeanor for doing what, exceeding the authorized use of a computer under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, recognized that 35 years was kind of severe. So her sentence was commuted, and she's scheduled to get out in a couple of weeks and start her new life, which we know will not be easy, but there's a number of us who will be quietly supporting her behind the scenes. Yeah, it's, yes.
Yeah, I'm really curious if there's any insights about Leonard Peltier and why he wasn't released, and also, you know, you talk about the government dealing with the press. What about the radical press like we did in Democracy Now? Tavis Smiley does a lot of things talking about serious issues.
Yeah, I can't speak to Leonard Peltier's case. It's a tragedy.
The FBI.
There's a whole lot of people who are incarcerated just because the government wants to punish. We're an incredibly punitive society. By far, even when you compare us to traditional dictatorships, we by far have the highest incarceration rate. It's an extraordinary tragedy. This idea that just put them away. Remember, it's a for-profit enterprise. So you're incentivized to prosecute because you make money off of prisoners. It's a sad reflection on who we are as a nation. We have many, many contradictions, and I'm painfully aware of those given what I experienced. But in my own small way, I can give voice to those who don't have voices. I can give voice to those who are voiceless. I have give those, I've met any number since I became so public. I've met any number of people who have suffered far more egregiously than I ever did. The only difference is I didn't end up in prison. But I know how close it came. I know that it's very possible that I would still be in prison today.
And you've suffered too. I mean, I can tell. I mean,
I don't talk about it much on a very personal level, partly because of who I am, and relying on the extraordinary support of a very, very small handful of people. I pretty much lost everybody in my life. You find out who really are your friends when you're facing the most dire circumstances. It's amazing how quick people disappear, fair weather friends, or just simply turn their back on you. And yes, as I shared with some of you privately earlier today, I suffered in a number of ways, right? Not just loss of social networks, but on a deeply psychological and physical level. And it's still ongoing. I didn't realize it, so I don't often talk about this, but it just gives you an opportunity to make it a little bit more personal. I recognize I also had, ironically enough, special training in the military to deal with resisting those who would want to take your life away or severely restrict it. And I did employ some of that training during the worst of my ordeal. But about halfway through the 14-month ordeal of facing 35 years in prison, and then facing that 35 years down, I found out and discovered one morning when I woke up that I, in fact, was experiencing the overt symptoms of PTSD. I knew that. It has not been easy.
do you want to tell the story of your cat?
Oh, Joe the cat. Yeah, Joe the cat's. I don't know. It is deeply personal. I mean, it's a cat that was abused, was in an animal shelter, an adoption center. A cat that it took several years before I could even approach him, because there was some male in the early part of his life that tortured this cat because they could, and I would come home after an incredibly exhausting day. I mean, I spent most of 6 months in sealed hearings. These were closed hearings in the federal district courthouse in downtown Baltimore. Sealed hearings. None of this is public. They're all sealed. Very little of it has been made public. Although what's been made public is actually hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. Right? And I would come home and the cat, Joe, I mean, it's extraordinary. You talk about the bond between a human and just a pet cat, right? Would come up to me and, you know, what can I say? You know, stress disappeared. In that moment, you know, you're whole again. But it wasn't just Joe the cat. My son, my extraordinary son, Zachary, is 22. He's about to graduate from college. He was 12 years old when the FBI showed up at the front door. He had the presence of mind to say, Dad, there's someone here to see you. Yeah. He suffered too. But he was born with a severe heart defect and went through multiple operations. But I remember coming home during the darkest period, which was probably the January, February, March period. And he would simply look at me, he was born with aortic stenosis, for those of you who are pediatric cardiology. Went through multiple operations, including open heart surgery, still facing open heart surgery to secure his life as a normal adult for a normal life. And so he lives in the moment because that's all he's had. And he would simply look at me and he said, Dad, you need a hug. He's dedicated the rest of his life to sustaining life. That's his focus, okay? Yes, in the corner.
Do you think the Constitution can survive? Can it work in today's technology and everything else?
Ooh, can the Constitution survive? It's been through a lot in its 230 years. I mean, Madison is credited with having imagined the Constitution. He had 4,000 volume library. I've actually stood in his library looking out to the Blue Ridge. I used to live on the South Fork of the Shenandoah looking east. And he had to imagine the Constitution knowing that the lower angels of us often take precedence. How do you create a governance structure? What's the best way to govern ourselves? Not easy. We're not, as a species, we don't govern ourselves very well. We just don't. I tend to align in US history. There are other forms of governance, and that would be a much larger conversation. But I tend to align in terms of US history with the Jeffersonian form of democracy, which he who is best governed is least governed. But that requires significant responsibility on the part of the individual. But see, you know, I've lived primarily in terms of where I've lived overseas as well. I'm actually directly related to Sir Francis Drake by way of his brother. So I've got the pirateer in me, not just being commissioned by the Queen to go off and do good things for the crown. Yeah, okay. Where was I? A little historical detour there. Can the Constitution survive? Growing up in Vermont every day, I mean every year, that one day, the extraordinary day in March was town meeting day. That was liquid democracy, living democracy right there. Fred Cooper, who you could not understand because he had an incredibly thick Vermont brogue, would speak for about 30 minutes and no one interrupted him. Because Fred Cooper, speaking of conscience, was a conscience of the community. Now he had a ramshackle farm. People never figured out how he ever milked his cows. It turned out he had a fairly well-off brother who, you know, kept him in hay. And the cows. He would say his piece, and he would remind the town of those promises we had made to ourselves. And he would say, what of those promises, which of those promises had we kept? And he would actually congratulate us. He would commend us. But he'd also remind us of those we had not kept. He spent most of his time driving around, just seeing what people are doing, how things are going, and talking. and listening. He spent most of his time listening, it turns out. And every year he spoke for 30 minutes. And every year we were reminded of who we were as a community. Fred Cooper was our mirror. He was our conscience as a community. The Constitution is a living document. It's just a piece of paper. It sits, the original quote-unquote document sits at the National Archives. Many politicians have stood with their back facing those documents and have spoken in very eloquent language, including President Obama. In fact, he was actually there where he spoke about how critical it was for the role of whistleblowers. Who better to hold the government to account? So, I do fear for the Republic. I actually do. There is nothing in history, and I'm more than a passing student of politics and history, there's nothing in history that immunizes us from the tides of history. All empires have come and gone. The arrogance to think that somehow American exceptionalism will win the day is utter historical hubris. Next question. Yes, ma'am.
Are there a few things that Congress could do that would make a real difference? And if so, what are those few things?
Well, my flip answer is I just want to get back to 9/10. In terms of whistleblowing, one of the problems has been, although I invoked a number of statutes that ostensibly protected whistleblowers, there's no recourse, there's no cause of action, no recourse in the court system if you're retaliated against. Essentially, no matter what the words say, it's all paper tiger. There was an Enhancement Act, but it essentially still leaves it, and there's a huge cutout for national security. I say this rhetorically because I recognize that in this audience, particularly this audience, the amount of national treasure that we have spent since 9/11 combined on all forms of national security, defense, homeland security, multiple trillions. For what? Because we failed to protect the nation and keep almost 3,000 people out of harm's way? Wow. I don't know, why don't we declare war on cars? There's way more people killed every year on the highways. Maybe the roads are endangering the social order of things. Congress, unfortunately, as I quickly discovered, has been largely co-opted. There's very few representatives or senators who are able to withstand the enormous temptations that come along with corruption and payoff. I'll give you one example in terms of my own history. Because I used to be in executive session many times at NSA with Michael V. Hayden at the podium. He made it clear that the only person he cared about in Congress, the one that actually mattered, was Porter Goss, who at the time was the chairman of the House Intel Committee. Now, remember, the House Intel Committee, along with the Senate, was set up as a standing permanent committee to oversee, provide oversight of the secret side of government. But the only person he cared about was Porter Goss, because the chair has enormous power. So they made sure that NSA got what they wanted. You have because I've had people who have encouraged me to run for office. I already gave up enough. I'm sure how much more I can give. I don't know if there's a fifth opportunity to serve my country. But I pause, right? Because I'm well aware of the extraordinary temptations of power. And even a mere representative has to spend most of their time, right, hunting for money of various kinds. It's not easy. And there are a few, and I'm in touch with some of them, primarily off the record, who are managing to at least stay afloat in terms of rule of law and what's best for the nation. But they're an extraordinarily small minority. Because here's the other conundrum we face as we the people. Most people don't seek this kind of office. And in fact, in the original Constitution, it was not supposed to be a lifer position. You would do your thing for a couple of years, because that was the people's Congress. Then you would go home. You were on loan. You didn't turn it into a permanent career. Or, as some are revolving door of other parts of the government, or into certain parts of the military, industrial, intelligence, congressional complex. Because that revolving door, believe me, is alive and well. I used to work at Booz Allen, and I got up to management level. And if there's one person who exemplifies what it means to be a company man through and through, and I'm going to actually state a name, it's Mike McConnell. The reason I'm mentioning Mike McConnell, he used to be the director of NSA in the early to mid 90s. When he retired as a Navy Admiral, 3-star, he went to Booz Allen. Then he got the call to serve as the DNI. So he served in the DNI position with something other than distinction. That's my take. But I realize I don't give any of these people much quarter for obvious reasons. Guess what he does? He returns to Booz Allen and Hamilton. So he's a perfect illustration of what happens, because the temptations are enormous. If you're getting paid upwards of several million, right, as a base salary, you probably are going to get used to it. You know, it's a nice lifestyle. I remember at Booz Allen, just to give you a sense of this, and I'll give you another story, where I remember when I was at headquarters in Tyson's Corner. We had moved there, in fact, when I was there from Bethesda. And I remember overhearing a conversation between two partners. And they were actually asking each other, what are you going to do with your bonus this year? And one of them said, well, I'm not sure, maybe it'll be that, you know, that new Porsche. The other one said, I've had my eye on a summer cottage. I don't know, maybe one on the other coast would do this time. So I was accelerate forward a few years, post 9/11. I was actually the NSA Corporate Advisory Board representative to the International Council on Systems Engineering. I also have a very technical background. And at this, it was at Stevens Institute of Technology. And the president of Stevens has this extraordinary views of Lower Manhattan. It's phenomenal, because you're sitting up there on the cliffs, you know, on the other side looking across. And the president of the university, and it's not uncommon for presidents, many of them have a college-provided residence, and his house was set up for entertaining, the lower floors. I was in what I can only call the tart room, the dessert room. We're talking, it was a conference as well, so it was really fancy, right? A lot of corporate sponsors who are part of the military, industrial, intelligence, congressional, cybersecurity complex. Remember the farewell address of one Dwight D. Eisenhower, which was a rather obscure address because it was the advent of Camelot. Those words have come back to haunt me many, many times, because he knew what had been created in the 1950s. So I'm sitting there in the tart room, and a very, not mention this name, very senior official from the advisory board, the highest level advisory board, to the Secretary of Defense. It's a science board. And he's chit-chatting there as we're looking at this really fancy dessert trays arrayed around us, and also stacked up about 3 feet high, depending on what you were looking at. I mean, this is that type of display, right? And he said, senior executive, don't stay in 5 years tops. Don't, no longer than that. With what your background, you'll be able to make 4 or 5 times what you're making now. Now, I took a pay cut as a principal in a very small boutique.com to join NSA. That should give you a sense that I was actually doing fairly well before I joined NSA as a senior executive, but I was going to serve my nation again. All he was talking about, this was 3 years after 9/11, was how much money he was making. And I'm sitting there thinking, what Constitution? Who cares? Just national security is worth a lot of money. And in terms of NSA, it's a golden age of surveillance. Tremendous amounts of money are being made by the 1%. At whose expense? And what price are we paying as a country and as a nation? Do you know, and this is a rhetorical question, what could you do with $1 trillion in terms of the general welfare? What is it about militarizing, and this is literally the case that happened after 9/11. I'm going to drop another dark secret. It's an open secret. The United States is treating the entire globe as a military battlefield. Literally. And it doesn't matter where you are. And that includes the internets. Yes.
I'm wondering, since you were broke and you had to rely on a public defender, how you managed to avoid prison. I mean, can you say a little bit about, you went to trial, or and did you get other people that...
This is, I didn't, because I was hoping someone would ask me so I can actually share this, because it is critical to how I was able to hold out the government. Because some people still think I went to prison for at least some short period of time. You know, some people think that. When I was so unceremoniously indicted and so very publicly, it was clear that the odds were long. And the mainstream media was deferring to Obama. Why would a president and an attorney general named Eric Holder, someone who, interesting enough, I ended up confronting at an Apple store, it actually made the press. Why would they go after me in the manner they did? Because it's important for you to understand, I was the signature case under Obama. You can't understand any of the other cases brought forward more than all other presidents combined. All other presidents combined, without understanding my case. My case is critical to understanding that. So the mainstream media thought I was really a bad person. Why would I be charged with gravely damaging the national security of the United States? Her ears are probably burning right now, but Jessalyn Radack led the media strategy. She was my voice when I had none. And slowly, it took a long time, besides a Rittenhour Truth-Telling Prize, which I had many meetings with her and Jane Mayer clandestinely for several months prior to the New Yorker article that was published called Secret Share, an Enemy of the State. The 60 Minutes special with Scott Pelley, who was about to take over as the CBS news anchor from Katie Couric. He was their senior correspondent. And then it turned out 2 extraordinary Washington Post op-eds saying, hey, maybe government, he is a whistleblower, maybe there is a First Amendment here, and by the way, we do have an interest in what goes on inside government. We're the press. But it took a phenomenal effort. And so literally on the eve of trial, facing public trial, we had already selected the jurors. The alternates were in place. There was a 15-minute window during a break on a Thursday afternoon. Because I would never, as I said earlier, I would never plead bargain with the truth. And that meant I was not going to plead to anything under any circumstance of something I had not done. Now, speaking of my conscience, I had in fact gone to the press, but it's not a violation of the law to go to the press. The government assumed that I went to the press with top secret information. It's interesting that going to the press is now considered a criminal act by default. Just think about Trump. But this is under Obama. So they agreed on my terms to drop all the felony counts in exchange for a minor misdemeanor. And that's with the proviso that there would be no jail time and there would be no fine. At sentencing, if you want to hear an extraordinary defense of the Constitution, just listen, or in this case read, because I was there to listen, read Judge Richard Bennett's just takedown of the Department of Justice and the government's case against me at the July 15th pro forma sentencing. He said, you put Mr. Drake and his family through 4 years of hell. He doesn't pass the smell test. We don't do that to an American. We had a revolution a few years ago over this very issue. He well knew, because the government, it turned out, wanted to continue to litigate the case at the sentencing. See, they claimed, another punchline for you, they claimed that what I did was worse than being a spy. And if there was something stronger than the Espionage Act, they would have used it against me. That what I did endangered the lives of American soldiers, and I would have the blood of their hands. The blood of their hands on my hands, the blood of their bodies on my hands. Because it is really hard for me to say this. This is where I get to a point, even when I'm in front of an audience like you, where I understand why Ellsberg himself, Daniel Ellsberg, doesn't talk about the 2 years in which he was actually at trial. After 40 plus years, he said it's still too painful. In the courtroom, there was a point where the government, before the judge, argued that what I did was worse than being a spy, and that the only eyewitness to the crimes that I had committed against the state, remember I was declared an enemy of the state, the only eyewitness was the reporter of record in the indictment. They actually threatened to bring that reporter into the courtroom to testify against me, although she wouldn't have. The judge said, we're not going to go down that deep, dark hole. But then they proceeded to say later that what I did was worse than being a spy, because spies give up their secrets in secret to other spies. What Mr. Drake did was disclose national security secrets to a reporter. It was put on the front page of the paper of record for NSA, which is in the Baltimore paper, the main Baltimore paper. And everybody gets to read it, including the spies. So it was a huge victory when I went out onto the courthouse steps, which is still an arrested moment for me, as I said, wow, there is a third branch of government. And so I was able to prevail because I had constitutional rights and I exercised those rights. What you also need to know is that the government, during the motions phase of the pretrial criminal proceedings, attempted to eliminate as relevant or admissible anything related to my whistleblowing, anything related to the First Amendment, and anything related to this classification scheme. What you also need to know is that the government prosecutor, who no longer works in the government, committed a number of violations, including doctoring evidence, manipulating evidence, and withholding evidence. A claim was made in February, well into the motions phase. It was in a conference call in which he said that the documents in which I had provided the Department of Defense Office Inspector General over several years had been destroyed. Do you know it's a Brady Giglio violation for those who are lawyers to destroy evidence? This would have been, exculpatory, right? And for the government, it would have been, exculpatory evidence. So they didn't want any evidence. The judge would not buy off on that. So, but in the end, I was wiped out. I'm still facing extraordinary debt that I am attempting to pay off. I had to mortgage my house. I had to empty pretty much every bank account that I had, including most of my retirement I did have, a retirement 401k, in order to pay the extraordinarily steep legal fees at $500+ an hour until I ran out of money. There were lawyers, some have asked me, I'll just insert this, because someone said, why didn't the ACLU come to your defense? This would have been the perfect First Amendment case. This is where the ACLU and I part ways, unfortunately. I have a lot of respect for individuals in the ACLU, but as an institution, they chose not to defend me. And in fact, the only person The only person during the final motion hearing that submitted a friend of the court brief, which was actually accepted by the judge in terms of my own history, which was really the public interest defense against state crimes and government wrongdoing and massive multi-billion-dollar fraud, waste, and abuse. The only person who submitted a friend of the court brief was Jesselyn Radak. No other organization in the United States submitted any, nor do they publicly defend me. That should tell you something about not just those organizations, but also about giving due deference to the government, because I must have really been a bad person to be charged with espionage. You have to remember that Ellsberg himself was declared the most dangerous man in America by Henry Kissinger. And he had top secret information on a Vietnam history report regarding the bright and shining lie of Vietnam, and went public.